Welcome to Physical Transformation in Children's Media. I'm your moderator, Courtney Polidori, and I teach children's literature at the College of New Jersey. This panel literally started with a nightmare. When my son was little, he woke up one night terrified because of a short story he had read in school about a girl who transforms into a deer as she runs through a moonlit forest to get help for her sick and dying mother. He explained the plot as I wiped away his tears. That's how I met Joanna, a short story by Jane Yolen, published in Shapeshifters in 1978. Rich in figurative language, imagery, and suspense, it's a great classroom text. During her transformation, Joanna feels more powerful, stronger, lighter, and faster than she ever has before. Until, at the end, the doctor she was searching for shoots and kills her. The story ends. My students' hearts break. I tell you this story to introduce our panel today because it embodies so many of the debates we'll explore. Children's authors are magicians, transforming humans into animals through anthropomorphism. The effect is spellbinding. From the one and only Ivan to Charlotte's Web to the Giving Tree, or Aesop's Fables. Animated film studios that master metamorphosis win awards like Spirited Away, Ponyo, The Song of the Sea, or Wolfwalkers. Hogwarts has a whole class devoted to the study of transfiguration. And don't get me started on Marvel. Even respected graphic novelists like C.C. Bell and Art Spiegelman, who wrote Mouse, turn themselves into animals to tell their stories. But why do adults creating for children rely on animals to teach lessons, to share society's values, to protect children from trauma? If children's lit should be mirrors and windows, like author Grace Lin and other scholars argue, then why do kids spend so much time reading about animals rather than meeting diverse human characters? First, sophomore Avina Sharma is going to present her research into the entangled relationship between children's literature and physical transformation. Then, sophomore Angie Tamayo Leon will investigate the overpopulation of animals in children's literature. She'll reveal that creators sometimes turn characters of color into animals, resulting in less representation on screen or in the page. And sophomore Jared Woods will talk about Grace Lin's new novel, Mulan, Before the Sword, which incorporates fascinating examples of transformation. He'll also look at whether Asian American fairy tales incorporate transformation differently than Western stories. And finally, Zoe Talbot, our sophomore and panel leader, will explore the irony of creators using anthropomorphism to teach humans lessons. We will closely examine a range of texts, but we won't have time to get to every example. So we ask that you please write down any questions you have or examples of transformation, and we'll discuss them during the Q&A following our presentation. Thank you. I'd like to start by introducing the participants in our roundtable, Physical Transformation in Children's Media. First up, we have Avina Sharma. Her presentation is Into the Entangled Relationship Between Children's Literature and Physical Transformation. Then we have Angie Tamayo's Erasure of BIPOC Characters in Children's Media, followed by Jared Woods, Culture as Represented and Reflected in Kidlit. And then we have Zoe Talbot, Human Nature Through Things That Are Not Human. And we've featured photographs of each of our presenters as children to get into the spirit of children's literature. We set some goals for this roundtable when we first began thinking about it. Our first goal is that we're going to try to understand why creators and authors use anthropomorphism in children's media to convey lessons and ideas. Then we'll determine why or why not this method is an effective way of portraying human nature and life lessons. And finally, we will discuss why a creator would make the decision to make the human something else to learn a lesson before they are able to return to their life or change the trajectory.
Hello, everyone. My name is Avina Sharma, and today I will be discussing the entangled relationship of children's literature and transformation. Let's begin. What is anthropomorphism? This is assigning human characteristics to non-human entities, such as animals or inanimate objects. Some human-like characteristics include, but are not limited to, motivations, intentions, and even emotions. Anthropomorphism appears in tales old and new, examples being Greek myths, Aesop's fables, and even Winnie the Pooh. Anthropomorphism and personification are commonly confused. So personification is implementing figurative language to give inanimate objects human-like characteristics, whereas anthropomorphism is when non-human things display human traits and emotions, as well as being capable of human behavior. As Burke and Copenhaver say, simply put, anthropomorphism involves assigning a human trait to an animal or object. Transmogrification, people morphing into animals, is a special case of anthropomorphism. This process has a long and respected history in many world cultures, meaning that transmogrification is a feature of anthropomorphism, but is not all it is, which we will get into more later. So the psychology of human stories. Children's books exist for several purposes, being literary education, moral education, and pleasure. Animals as characters add elements of humor and incongruity and much more. Burke and Copenhaver also say having animals do the acting and mistake-making allows the face-saving emotional distance often needed to be able to join the conversation. Disney's anthropomorphized woodland creatures allows children to connect. Animal characters are perceived to be simple in nature with impactful content. So here's the transformation of the trends, topics, and issues that were exemplified through anthropomorphism in children's literature starting from 1840, when it was used to describe concepts like morals and responsibilities, and now more recently, as we see here in 2003, it has been expanded to discussing important topics like gay rights, gangs, and drugs. Historical issues and current concerns about anthropomorphism. Xenophanes in 6th century BC was the first to use anthropomorphism. The term anthropomorphism is derived from the Greek words anthropos, meaning human, and morph, meaning shape or form. It dives more into unobservable characteristics of non-humans rather than descriptive reports of a non-human's observable or imagined behavior. Children appear to anthropomorphize non-humans more than adults, which we will also learn more in a little bit. So there is a three-factor theory that ties into anthropomorphism, which is that it explains when people are likely to anthropomorphize based on three psychological determinants. Elicited agent knowledge, which is the accessibility and applicability of anthropocentric knowledge. Affective motivation, which is the motivation to explain and understand the behavior of other people, and sociality motivation, which is the desire for social contact and affiliation. There are many debates about anthropomorphosis. As some people say, it represents accurate or fallacious thinking, that it has descriptions, whether its descriptions have any place in scientific discourse, or whether it can account for phenomena ranging from religious belief to effective marketing campaigns. In simple terms, there is a debate whether anthropomorphism should really be used in literature and whether it does serve a purpose. So there are three main psychological determinants, and those are known as SEEK, which is sociality, affectance, and elicited knowledge. This determines the extent to which a person anthropomorphizes a non-human by altering the activation, correction, and application of anthropomorphic knowledge during the inductive reasoning process. Each of these factors makes unique predictions about variables that will influence the tendency to anthropomorphize non-humans. So let's begin with sociality. This is the need and desire to establish social connections with other humans. So this enables a perceived human-like connection with non-humans. It satisfies people's motivation for social connection, and anthropomorphism will increase when people feel a lack of social connection and vice versa. Then there's affectance, and this is the need to interact effectively with one's environment. So this is attributing human characteristics and motivations to non-humans, which increases the ability to make sense of a non-human's actions, reduces the uncertainty associated with an agent, and increases confidence in predictions of this agent in the future, which is all according to this theory of affectance. And this theory centers around the anxiety associated with uncertainty and the importance of predicting a non-human's behavior. Elicited knowledge is the elicitation of knowledge itself, meaning this is the basis for induction. The basis for induction is knowledge about ourselves, and as more knowledge about non-humans is acquired, knowledge about humans is less likely to be used as a basis for stories. Activation of alternate knowledge structures will influence the application of accessible knowledge to a given target. So basically, this means that when you're younger, you're learning more about the world, and according to psychology, children are more likely to know more about humans rather than more about animals, because that's something you learn more when you're older. So children may attribute human characteristics to animals simply because they don't see much of that difference yet, or that big, disparity between the actions of animals and humans. So now I'm going to dive into the 4 influences of anthropomorphism, which is dispositional, situational, developmental, and cultural. So the dispositional influence is the need for cognition. This is the ready accessibility of self-knowledge and one's own perspectives, which makes an anthropomorphic inference a likely intuitive anchor or starting point when reasoning about non-humans. There are differences in the extent people are motivated to expend attentional resources, which influences the extent to which people anthropomorphize non-humans. Those high in need for cognition show weaker evidence of anthropomorphism, assuming the presence of alternate non-anthropomorphic representations exist and can be accessed. Situational influence. This is perceived similarity in simple terms. So perceived similarity of targets to humans influences the extent to which people anthropomorphize non-humans. Non-human agents in literature and in everyday discourse are attributed mental states consistent with their morphological similarity to humans. Judgments of similarity, therefore, can influence anthropomorphism by activating human or self-relevant representations, or by activating specific stereotypes associated with humans. One example being in the story The One and Only Ivan. This is more of a children's story, and it is an emotional story of friendship between Ivan the gorilla, Stella the elephant, and a stray dog, Bob. The turmoil and range of emotions these animals face are indicative of human characteristics and evokes empathy in young readers. Then there's the developmental influence, and that is the acquisition of alternate theories. Most children appear to reason egocentrically first, before developing the tendency to reason from another person's perspective. Children develop a conceptual understanding of the self before an understanding of others, and a child cannot project properties of humans onto non-human agents without first developing representations of oneself and others. So that ties into what I was talking about earlier with children understanding humans first before other creatures such as animals. The social experience in early human life is primarily with other humans, including yourself. So understanding other humans in non-anthropomorphic terms would develop later in life, according to this theory. And religious believers make intuitive and automatic inferences about God's nature, which appears to be considerably more anthropomorphic than their deliberate and explicit reports. And we also have the cultural influence, which includes experiences, norms, and ideologies. Culture exerts its influence by providing distinct norms and ideologies about how people can relate to others and the natural world. This influences general levels of experience with particular non-humans and acquisitions of non-anthropomorphic representations. So this states that for children from rural cultures, knowledge about non-humans may be more readily accessible and deemed applicable for reasoning about animals, whereas for urban industrialized children, knowledge of biological kinds is more limited, and so they instead rely on anthropomorphism to reason about non-human animals.
Good afternoon. I am Angie Tamayo Leon, and I will be talking about the erasure of BIPOC, which is Black, Indigenous, People of Color, characters in children's media through transformation. I'd like to begin by discussing the variety of diversity in children's literature, or the lack thereof, who's being represented and who's not, and the majority is white children. A close second is animals, and following that is children of color. There are far more narratives with animals as protagonists than Black, Indigenous children of color. And if BIPOC children can't see themselves in literature or in media, their perception of what is socially acceptable shifts, meaning since most media is conveyed through white male narratives, those who are not of that identity will not see themselves accepted in the society in which they live, and they'll fail to occur intercultural and interracial narratives. The lack of representation doesn't only impact children of color, but it also harms white children, who could use children's books and movies as windows into different cultures and identities. To anthropomorphize non-white characters, it deliberately excludes their racial identity and undoes the racial diversity media companies such as Disney and Pixar claim to uphold. For instance, in the movie The Princess and the Frog, Tiana is a frog for the majority of the movie, stripping away her identity of a Black woman and creating a character that is less relatable to young girls. Other movie examples include Brother Bear, The Emperor's New Groove, Soul, and The Spies in Disguise. As the examples we've touched on before, these characters aren't allowed to learn and grow in their human forms. For some reason, they have to be turned into animals or others to show some type of intellectual or emotional growth. But that is not the same standard for white characters who are allowed to make mistakes and learn as themselves. When children of color are not portrayed in these famous stories and fairy tales, there are dire effects. It makes them question their place in history and society. It makes them wonder, why do these fairy tales tell me and about others? Why am I not in these fairy tales? If that movie is perceived by society, what does that mean about where I belong in society? Prior to the introduction of Tiana from The Princess and the Frog, the race message was clear. Princesses are white, and if you are not white, then you cannot be a real princess. So the introduction of Tiana as the first Black princess was a huge step forward. However, it was not executed in the proper manner. By portraying Black and Latinx and Native American characters as non-human for the majority of their development within films, Disney dehumanizes their characters. Because of this, young children are unable to see themselves represented as they are, which reinforces cultural and racial hegemony. Children's media has an enormous stake in the cultural and racial perception of our country. Movies are meant to both reflect and produce our modern culture. However, as of now in children's media, there isn't a wide variety of protagonists of color due to the transformations they are forced to undergo, which leads us to consider and question why that is. Why aren't BIPOC characters allowed to learn and grow in human form? Is it due to the majority of producers and directors being white men who fail to write enriching stories of color and find it easier to transform characters into animals or others? Or is it a blatant excuse to continue the racially white hegemony? Thank you.
Hello, my name is Jared Woods, and I will be talking about anthropomorphism and its use to represent and reflect culture in children's literature. One of the most valuable mechanisms of anthropomorphism, especially when it comes to children's literature, is its great ability to work as symbolism. This can come to mind when you think of classic Western fables like The Tortoise and the Hare. However, there's a growing utilization of anthropomorphism to translate more diverse and traditional folklore and stories into the forefront of popular kids' literature to reach an audience of children previously unexposed. In this case, I will be examining Grace Lin's Milan Before the Sword, and the stories which I'll be focusing on in the novel stem from Eastern folklore, specifically Beijing and the northern Chinese regions. In the first example I will present, you will notice how Lynn is able to take the traditional lore of a figure called Lord Rabbit and represent him as her character of the Jade Rabbit. Now, what's so significant and, in my view, fascinating about this is the accurate correlation between the two figures. I'm just going to quickly summarize the origin of Lord Rabbit as it pertains to Lynn's use, because there are many different origins and adaptations. However, in this case, during the rule of the Han Dynasty, rabbits were highly regarded as sources of food, and to some degree it was thought they had medicinal properties. This later became somewhat of a folk idealization of what the rabbit symbolized, and you can still find these little statues of the lore that became of the Lord Rabbit. From this idealization of the rabbit, there became the story of a rabbit who lives on the moon and comes down to Earth to heal people, also known as the Lord Rabbit. So Lynn quite carefully aligns her character of the Jade Rabbit with the lore of the Lord Rabbit, having the Jade Rabbit be imbued with the same origin and builds his traits off them. For example, as is symbolized by the idea of the rabbit, the Jade Rabbit is a selfless, patient, and wise character who brings relief and comfort. Now, as we will see from my next example, Gracelyn is able to do the same thing, but instead of borrowing figures from traditional lore, she also alludes to figures grounded in popular history. In her character of Daji, an evil fox spirit who can transform into any form she likes, she borrows from the popular figure of Daji, lover to Emperor Zhao of the Shang Dynasty. Now, in history, Daji was known as a cruel and wicked ruler to her people. It is believed that she once even went boating on a pond of wine. It was even said that she was possessed by an evil fox spirit. And this is where Grace Lynn borrows again from tradition and figures more representative of great stories unknown by Western mainstream literature, especially children's literature. So Lynn takes these qualities and origin of Daji and directly imbues them into her own character, symbolizing her mischievous ways with the complementary and similar symbolism of the fox. Now, why does Gracelyn make such an effort to set up her characters as rooted in tradition? Simply, in the notes of her own novel, she asks the question, why were there so few Asian characters around me? And through anthropomorphism, she is able to represent traditional characters from Eastern folklore and have them as being compatible and allegorical and symbolic figures for children's literature. So students who have not been exposed to what she calls the endless treasure trove of magic and wonder can start to have a broader view of different cultures and styles of literature. Similarly, those who have already been exposed to this literature, likely as it relates to their own culture and their own family stories, they can see representation for themselves and of themselves in their own literature. So that is why I think, and I hope going forward in the future, anthropomorphism can be utilized to such a variety of ways to highlight different cultures and their traditional stories and lore, and the frequent moral and ethical conclusions that fit quite well with children's literature. I especially find this as quite a fascinating use of literature that has helped me learn more about cultures, traditions, and ideologies that I was previously unaware of. Thank you.
Hi,
Hi, I'm Zoe Talbot, and I will be talking to you about human nature through things that are not human. We have explored anthropomorphic theory in addition to historical and contemporary contexts, but how do we understand these methods ethically or even practically? Why do we as humans choose to portray ourselves to things without our complex qualities? And why do some humans have to become animals or otherwise transform before they can reach their happy ending? We understand human nature to be the fundamental traits that make us who we are, biologically, socially, and developmentally. Anthropomorphism works effectively because there are no connections. They are windows and mirrors into a child's life. If you see a tortoise or a hare, they are fast or slow, but that's all, you know? A child can sort of reflect onto that and understand that and apply themselves to those lessons. As Nicomathian ethics show, our account of this science will be adequate if it achieves such clarity that the subject matter allows. However, when you take a human and choose to make them undergo a transformation, we are pushing all of their nature, social class, psychological issues, morality, and other dispositions, and forcing it into a creature that already has its own connotations in the world already, and associations begin to form. In Disney's 1994 rendition of Beauty and the Beast, the prince is only 11 years old when he undergoes the transformation to make him into the beast he is. He is labeled selfish by the witch for not letting a stranger into his home, and doomed to suffer for a decade because of an instinctual adolescent choice. And the witch makes an entire palace of people suffer alongside him for not letting a stranger into his house. Thinking critically, of course, this is a more nuanced situation than that, but Disney's not aimed towards scholars or philosophers or people who would think critically about it. It is for children. And at first glance, what are children supposed to take away from this? Let's consider a new example, the Emperor's New Groove. Young and self-absorbed Emperor Cusco is transformed into a llama and seeks out the help of a villager named Pacha to help him transform back. On this journey, he learns more about how his actions affect the villagers and how he needs to be more introspective about how he lives and leads. This is closer to achieving this goal of storytelling because it's more child-oriented and more straightforward, but even then there are questions to be raised about motives. Cusco's transformation wasn't a mission of ethics like the beasts, right? He was transformed because the antagonist Yzma wanted to be the emperor, and it was a failed murder attempt. So what does that teach anyone? These stories, among many others, are understood to be karmic metamorphoses. Characters with bad qualities are punished, and they undergo their journey as something other than themselves, and overall learn from their experiences before they can change their trajectory. However, what about characters who have done nothing wrong but suffer the consequences anyway, like in Soul? Tiana of Disney's Princess and the Frog is a hardworking, ambitious young woman who would do anything to achieve her dreams of opening a restaurant in New Orleans like her father wanted. Even so, Prince Naveen of Maldonia is transformed into a frog, and when she kisses his frog form, she is also transformed despite doing everything right in her life. However, on the way, she learns that things are not always as they seem, and that intangible things like love and whimsy can be just as fulfilling as the things she has worked so hard to obtain. Each of these three individuals become animals, but initially they still have their human qualities. They're headstrong, or stubborn, or distanced. However, animals can't do what humans can, both physically or emotionally. Cusco struggles without his thumbs initially, and Tiana's disgusted by the thought of being covered in mucus. They have to adapt to their bodies and learn its strengths. By being distanced from their human nature, they learn. Morally, they still have a consciousness, and they still have free will and free agency, which humans do, unlike animals, but if they don't learn to change, it will end poorly for them. In this sense, they all must identify the parts of themselves they need to change and shed them in their animal forms. They must adapt. Beast and Cusco must learn how to not be selfish and must change themselves, learning that other people have their best interests and care for them. Tiana must learn to enjoy the present, and that having wishes and fantasies are not the worst thing. By adapting, they're able to trek forward their lives and achieve their fairy tale endings with the people they love. The real moments of growth are not when these individuals change, but when other people see the change within them. Belle is authentic, and she's herself from the start. She wouldn't change for anyone else. And when the beast starts to show compassion, she finds companionship within him. Pacha recognizes that Cusco is scared and a kid trying to lead that was just thrown into this position. Tiana and Naveen make friends, and while Tiana learns that the prince is not as shallow as he seems, Naveen learns about Tiana's ambition and falls in love with her. Our human nature is not about the form we take, but rather the qualities that other humans are able to recognize, and also what we see within ourselves. Thank you. Now, summarizing, Avina talked to us about the theories and motives behind anthropomorphism and its influences, giving us a theory of foundation on anthropomorphism as it is. Angie focused on transfiguration of BIPOC characters as a form of erasure and racial identity. Jared discussed anthropomorphism, how it can act as the intersection where cultural representation can meet these palatable animalistic characters that offer allegorical lessons between the Eastern and Western cultures. And I talked to you about how characters learn about human nature through their animal counterparts and other humans. Returning to our goals from the beginning, we'd like to talk about we'd like to come to understand why creators use anthropomorphism in children's media, determine why or why not this is effective, and discuss why a creator would make this choice. Why do people decide to take, instead of using anthropomorphism, why did they decide to use transfiguration instead? And for discussion, or at least initially, because our questions might lead to other questions that we can further discuss, what intentions might creators have making the deliberate decision to have characters undergo transformation? And is there a more efficient or effective way to convey these ideas? Why or why not? Thank you again.